Hello.
Hi,
Hello. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
What's your name?
My name is Charlie Eriksen.
Hey Charlie. And where are you? Where are you from?
Well, I'm originally from Denmark, but right now I live in Amsterdam.
Good. And what's your practice?
So I do Ashtanga yoga most days.
Right. Great. And how long have you been practicing?
I've been practicing for almost a year now.
Right. Great. And what brought you to the practice?
It was a little bit of a roundabout way. So for 7 years I was doing powerlifting, but I ended up kind of running into situations where, it wasn't necessarily so good for my body, injuries and stuff like that. And I also, at one point, was having a little bit of issues in my job, was about to quit. And I realized on the days when I practice or lift, right, I was so much more productive. So I was like, okay, I'm gonna focus a little bit less on work and start doing more exercise. So I was like, okay, what can I sort of add on to my powerlifting routine that maybe evens out things a little bit more, and yoga seemed like a reasonable thing. So I showed up at the nearest studio, and I haven't set foot in the gym since, right? I've basically just done my Ashtanga practice since.
So something important must have happened at that place, at that yoga studio. What was it that happened?
Oh, there was a lot of things, right? I think one is sort of you see yourself, right? You're faced with a challenge, and there's a challenge that I really wanted to overcome. There's also a feeling of being in a community that was, right, even though I didn't really talk to anybody, right, there was this sort of sense of like being amongst peers and fitting in. That was really appealing. And then just sort of seeing the progress every day. I ended up just really, like every night I would start to think about, oh, I'm so excited for my practice tomorrow, right? And start to prepare and sort of, it was hard to stop.
Yeah, great. What was if you don't mind me asking, what was one thing that you've had to face that right at the beginning that yoga helped you to face?
I mean, it's not just the beginning, but insecurities, right? You see yourself in very, well, not necessarily very clearly, but you certainly see yourself, right? You sort of see what's holding you back. And you see it in when you're working with a teacher, right? They will call you out if you're not there, right? For me, really being present was a challenge. So sort of being pulled back repeatedly was one of those things that really taught me that I can come back to sort of that stillness and just presence instead of sort of flying off in my mind.
So there was a presence you discovered about yourself.
Yes.
By kept going. What was that? What did that feel like?
Oh, that's a really interesting question, because I don't know that it feels a lot, right? It's really just more that it is, I think, for me. To the extent that it is, it also one of the things that really allowed me to connect with my body, right? Actually starting to feel the sensations in my foot, right? Starting to feel like each toe, and just getting that awareness of connecting with my body, because for such a long time, I have not been able to connect, right? I didn't see myself in the mirror, and there's other reasons for that, but sort of finding that and the process of that, and it's still ongoing, is I thought was really very fundamental. Like, I mean, you are who you are, and then if you don't really connect with that, right, then you get stuck in your mind and fly away, right? You run away in some way.
So there's something, I'm really interested in this sense of presence and what that was. And again, thank you for trying to help me to expand what that feels like. What did this presence, coming back to this presence, mean to you?
I think it really meant being able to look at a moment, like every moment, and making a decision about who I am. Right? It's seeing what situation am I in, and then taking the time to say, okay, I have these options, and not just going with it, whatever sort of first comes into my mind, and deciding, okay, do I choose to take this route or this route, right? Because they can be very different. And letting your mind, like have a strong tendency to just going with whatever sort of is your default, doesn't necessarily serve you well, right? But also, at the same time, it's also taking the time to connect with the people around me and actually having empathy, because that's always been a challenge, right? Really having empathy and connecting with others has always been a challenge for me.
Do you mind me asking why you think that is?
So I'm on the autism spectrum.
Right. And so can you expand a little bit more about how that's affected your life?
Yes, to the extent that, it's one of those things, right? If you have some sort of disability, like if you never had vision, right? I imagine it's kind of the same, where you don't really know what you're missing. But for me, I always knew from an early age that I had deficits on the social aspect. Things like understanding other people's viewpoints has always been really challenging, because for me to really have, if I see somebody crying or in need of support, it's a very active process for me to really go and be there for them, because I can't really put myself in other people's shoes very well. It takes me a very conscious effort to go and do that. It's not that I can't do it, but it is a process, right? So it's like, after if I'm sitting with somebody, right, and then they're not feeling good, I will start to feel it in like 5 to 10 minutes, right? And it comes down to sort of a context switching for me. Context switching for me is very difficult, which is why I tend to flow right? I tend to get in like the hyper focus, and it's physically painful for me to switch tracks, right? If somebody comes and interrupts me at my desk, I often have to go like, okay, give me 30 seconds. I just need to get back into myself, and then I will be there with you.
And so you found that yoga helps you to access the empathy, there's parts of you that's able to deal with that.
Yeah, it gives me it trains that muscle of coming back to myself, right? Because the mind will fly off, and that's fine, right? That's a part of the process, just when lifting weights, right? Up and down, it's coming back and letting go, coming back and letting go. And really exercising that, I think I've realized it's such an essential skill that you need to have, because otherwise you're just going to float with whatever sort of inertia that you've put into yourself.
So it's like you're flexing your empathy muscle.
Yeah, empathy both for myself but also for others, I think. Because if you don't really connect with yourself, right, it's very easy to do things to yourself that might be harmful to you. And that's not good for anybody. So
you feel that your practice has helped you to become less harmful to yourself?
Yes. Certainly I have more awareness of the impact of my actions, right? And how I act around myself and others. Yeah.
What do you think, like, as you've evolved, that you've learned as you kind of like, if you practice over that year, what do you think you've like learned now about yourself?
I think that's really hard to say what I've learned. It's probably easier to say what I haven't learned, right? Because it's really been, and I hate to almost sound like cliched in my ears, but I've really found myself in a way that I actually, right, going into it, I had no even intention of going down that route. But yeah, there's this thing of really meeting yourself in a very, I think, almost literal way, where it's like, oh, there's a thing, right? I don't want to call it a soul or a spirit either, but it's like there's me, and it's hard to grasp, but this is something that I haven't really accessed, right? And part of it is probably because it's hard for me to access the emotional side of my brain, but having that space and really having the space to do it, combining it with something that I'm already kind of comfortable with, and also again just taking the time to actually do it in a space every single morning, where you just it was never a conscious process for me, but I just found like, there's these things that come up, there's these sort of feelings that you suddenly feel that you can't really, I could never really name it until recently, right? Just basic emotions. Come to realize like, I have been feeling all these things, but I didn't have the ability to say what that feeling is. Maybe that's really the most fundamental thing that sort of everything is built on top of, right? If you can't identify your emotions in the present, right, you can't really move in life from a solid place, because then you don't know what you need.
And so you've discovered this all through the physical practice of Ashtanga yoga?
Yes, so the physical practice, I also have done pranayama teacher training with Laurent. And that was really, doing that was actually also just kind of on a whim, right? One of my teachers suggested that, hey, maybe that would be something for you, because I'm a very logical thinker, right? I can't really grasp things that I can't feel, or like if I don't put myself into it, it's very hard for me to learn. So I was like, I'll throw myself into this, right? Because for me, I need to challenge myself and push myself out of my comfort zone. So I was like, okay, 3 weekends, what's the worst thing that could happen, right? And the experiences I had during pranayama was one of those other doors that kind of opened to see just what the breath can do, right? How just a couple of slow exhalations can really just like put me back in to the driver's seat. So yeah, I mean, obviously that's a kind of a physical practice as well, I guess. And yeah, that's certainly it opened the door to this other side of the practice that sort of unfolds in front of you, whether or not you want it or not, I found.
Yeah. What do you think I know perhaps I'm asking this question again, but what do you think you've really learnt about yourself?
I mean, it's really innumerable, I think. I think it just comes down to both identifying with oneself, right? Being able to look in the mirror and see, that's me. But also realizing that's not me, right? Because there's this attachment to yourself can also kind of backfire a little bit, right? If you become too inward focused, and you, like I've tended to do, to sort of push away the outside. Because one of the flip sides to identifying or not identifying with yourself is that you are overly sensitive to the outside world, right? Like in autism, it's not really that you don't have empathy or you don't have emotions. It's just that they can be really overwhelming, and you don't have the ability to really express what it is, because it's so confusing, overwhelming. But again, having the ability to, be on your mat every day and face those feelings and taking the time to really just find yourself is right. It's a daily practice of finding some sort of peace.
Yeah. And what would you like others to know about what you've learnt about yoga?
I think the biggest thing is that it's just something, go and do it. Like, I'm sure it's gonna be, to the extent that it's gonna be different for everybody, it's also probably gonna be some of the same, right? Because when you look at like some of the sutras and stuff like that, right? I always thought like, nah, that I never connected with written things very well. It's like, nah, that's what other people experience. It's not what I would experience, right? There's just something that happens when you do it that's worth exploring, right? And maybe not everybody is at a stage. I don't think if I had done this 4 or 5 years ago, I don't think it would have stuck. I think I would not have been in a place where I was in a safe enough space to do it. But I think just taking the time and, trying it out, I think that's really the key for it, and just stick with it. It's like, find what works for you. It's like everybody's so different.
Thank you, Charlie.
Thank you.
Thanks for doing this.
You're welcome.
Appreciate it.